All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the June focus series. Can you believe we're almost halfway through the year? Today's topic is guiding clients through complex decisions around unplanned events. Now, if we think about unplanned events, we always want to start with the why. I think the key word here is this resilience. How do we build resilience in the financial plan? Because when it comes to unplanned events like death or disability or illness, we don't know when or if they're going to happen, but we want to make sure that when and if they do, that we have a plan in place for the client, that everyone in the family understands, and that we can create that certainty around what the impact will be, that there's resilience within that plan to withstand or weather that storm, and that everyone feels that comfort of knowing this is the plan and this is how we're going to achieve it. So as if we think about the last focus series, we focused on retirement planning, and we thought about it in these different phases or life stages, because we want to surface different conversations in each of these stages. So in the last focus series, we looked at how we could look at retirement for someone in that wealth accumulation or build up phase, and how we want to surface different conversations for clients that are in retirement already or in that preservation phase. And it's the same for unplanned events. If we think about unplanned events or those life stages in protection, we know that in that first stage, that wealth accumulation phase, the biggest asset for a client is their income, their ability to earn. And how do we protect it? So there, the conversation is really around protecting that income. But then as we move, as clients move into that wealth preservation phase, then we need to start thinking about balancing it. Our need for risk or protection sort of goes down while our need for saving and building up for retirement increases. So here the conversation is really around balance. And then if we think about clients in that retirement phase, here it's about really creating that feeling of organized, everyone is on the same page, we all understand what that's going to look like should something happen, and that our legacy or the client's legacy can be honored. So we want to create that real feeling, sense of peace and comfort in those times to know this is the plan, this is what that transition is going to look like, and that everyone is on the same page. So today I'm going to go through 3 different asset map scenarios, one in each of these phases, and talk about how asset map can visually surface these different conversations at those different points in time. So with that, I'm going to jump over to asset map. Just share again. And take a look at our first household. Okay, should be sharing now. Perfect. All right, so here we have the Clark family. So it's Kyle Clark, he's married to Christina. They're in their 40s. They have 2 young children, Jessica and Joshua. So they're very much in that build-up phase still. And let's just take a look at some of the things that Kyle has. And obviously we would look at this for both partners, but today I'm going to focus just in on one individual in the family. But if we have a look at Kyle, we can see, he's earning an income, he's building up his retirement fund through the employer, he's got some unit trusts, they've got a property with still quite a large home loan that they're paying off on that property, and he's got some risk benefits. Often through employers, we'll see, group life cover, there's some lump sum disability cover as well, specifically around the bond, and some income protection cover. Now, before we jump into the modeling and what that would look like, the first thing we're trying to establish is if something were to happen to Carl, whether that be death, disability, or illness, what would the impact be if that income fell away for the family in terms of, financially? How would they weather that? How would we protect against that and ensure that they can still have the lifestyle that they're leading now? And I want to point out a couple of key capturing things that we see, when it comes to lump sum or risk benefits in particular. So if I just click on the lump sum disability here, the key thing I want to point out with any capital disability or capital illness protection is we want to just make sure here at the bottom that we've selected lump sum as the benefit interval, and that we've put here that the benefit period will be years 1. Now, the reason for that is when we look at protection against death and disability, we always look at it in terms of if it had to happen today. So worst case scenario, it happened today, can the client withstand that? So in this example, we want to tell the model that if a disability happened today, this would pay out in year one. So it's a lump sum benefit that will be available immediately in the event of disability. Now, similarly for income protection, here we want to note that it's a monthly benefit. So in the event of a disability happening, this would pay monthly and it would continue paying until a specific age. Now that really depends on the policy that the client has. Sometimes it's 65, sometimes it's 70, even seen some that is whole of life now. So we want to put in how long it will continue to pay for. And also when it comes to income protection, the other thing we want to check is often these benefits will also keep up with inflation. Obviously, that is, again, policy dependent, but we want to go ahead and put that here under the COLA section to put in that this benefit will keep up with inflation. The other question we often get is sometimes there's waiting periods. Where do I note that there's a waiting period on a specific policy? So I would always suggest go ahead and put that in the notes section. You can bring it into the reporting, and I'll show you in the modeling how we bring that in as well. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what are some of the things we can talk about or surface from a conversation point of view. So here I've created target maps for Kyle in the event of death, so loss of life, disability, as well as long-term care or illness cover. I'm going to talk about each of those. Let's start with the loss of life. So remember here, the key, what we're trying to achieve or show the client is in the event of this happening, what would the needs of the family be? What sort of income would they need? What other costs would we need to cover in the event of a death? And then we can calculate from that how on track we are or what we could do differently. So if we have a look here, you'll see the defaulting is to say that Carl would want to replace 70% of what he's currently earning. In this case, it's the 630,000. But the first thing I want to talk about is the period. Often we say we want to protect that period from, now until Carl would have retired. That's the period that he would have been earning that income. That's the loss that we're going to experience. So we want to cover that period. But oftentimes in conversations with clients, it might be that they have different needs, and they might want a certain income amount for, until the kids are out of school, and a different amount thereafter. Or they may want to look at whole of life depending on, their personal circumstances. So the first key conversation we want to surface is what would the family need and for how long would we want to protect that income? And that's what we're putting in here. Then you'll see we can add things like covering debts. That's a conversation where we want to make sure that debt is completely taken care of in the event of death. Then let's have a look at that. And that'll default to debt across the household. So that's a conversation of do we want to clear all debt or just some of that debt, or what would that look like? Then, of course, there's, costs that would be incurred in the event of death that we want to make sure we bring into the calculation, as well as if there's young children, there may be education expenses that we want to specifically surface and engage with the client on. So that's step one, is really thinking about, in the event of this happening, what are the different incomes and needs for the family? And let's make sure we've got all of them here. And then importantly, what it's calculating here is it's saying, if that were to happen, what is the total capital needed today? So in this case, it's 15 million. But what is also, important to note with the client is these separate figures here. We can actually see how much capital is needed for each one of these needs. And that's an important conversation to surface, because then we're not linking, the amount of cover to say, the client needs 15 million. We're saying we need 12.6 million in order to cover this income need. We need 400,000 to cover each child's education need. So we're creating that connection between whatever cover or assets or amount we need and the purpose of that. And that really helps clients in making decisions around what do I want to really cover here, and what are some of the things that we can update or edit or change. So that's the first important point here. And then secondly, to move across to, well, what do we have already? So if we go across to the what you have section, you'll see right at the bottom here, I've included that group life cover, that's 4.5 million. And the model automatically is going to add that in and work out the difference. But a question we often get is the client also has assets and investments. Do I include those when planning in the event of death? And I think this comes down to that period that we're protecting. If we're looking at protecting the client just from the income they would have earned from now until retirement, then we'd rather not use the retirement assets here and keep them because the family will still need that retirement assets for retirement planning. But if we are looking at the, sort of whole of life in terms of planning for death, then we can include them. But this is a really important conversation to surface with clients around, yes, whilst we might have those assets, are we keeping them for retirement? And here we want to protect that period from, the period that the client would have been earning that income. So that's important to note here. And then, of course, what it means is going to summarize the two to say on the left, this is all the needs that we have and how much we would need for each need. And on the right, this is what we've got available. And that, of course, gives us then the deficit that we would need to put in place in order to be 100% funded and be able to achieve everything in this what you want section. And maybe one other key point to note is that it's based on this expected return. So what that means is that this client needs 15 million. But the reason they need 15 million is we're assuming that if death happened and we had, a policy that pays out 15 million, that would be invested at an expected return of 8%. Now, obviously, if the spouse is going to, keep those funds in a bank account or do that differently, then the amount we're going to need is different. So another key conversation we want to surface is that is the process that we'll take after that. And let's make sure that we're using the right return assumption here. Okay. The last tab will just show, how long the funds will last that we have already. So after we've covered those original capital needs that the client has, then we can see that it's lasting about 4 years. So one way of looking at it is saying is that will be what we could provide for that client, or alternatively, we would need to, of course, take out more cover or adjust the needs to around 30% of what the client is currently requesting. So that's on loss of life. If we go into disability, it's a very similar conversation. We want to understand, again, if something were to happen, what is that period that we want to protect for? And typically that would be, from now until the client retires. That's why it will default to that. But again, it's a conversation around what would those needs look like. And another key conversation we really want to think about in terms of disability planning is that if the client becomes disabled, we're protecting till they would retire, but then we also need to make sure their retirement planning is in place and that they can afford to do that as well. So we always want to have sort of add a line item here to say, what about saving for retirement? If you become disabled now, we still want to be, planning for and saving for that retirement for the future. So thinking about what sort of income protection do I need in order to also be saving and make sure we're okay in retirement. And then, of course, are there any other capital needs that we want to put in place or make sure that we can cover in the event of a disability, things like debts, but it could be, home changes or improvements that we would need to make or enhancements in the home. So we want to account for any capital needs. And there, if there is a capital need, we always want to put in, the start age today, because we're always assuming it's happening today. No end age, because it'll be a once-off capital need. All right. And then in terms of what you have, here you can see, right at the bottom again will be the risk benefits. I've included lump sum disability as well as income protection here at 37,500. We can see that that's continuing, and this is just a once-off amount that will pay out in the event of disability. We can also see here that this is where I can adjust things like waiting periods. So if a client's policy has a specific waiting period, I can click on the pencil here and you'll see it's starting today, but I could always say, I want to put in a date because it's actually going to have a 3-month waiting period. So it'll only start in, say in this case, in September, or I could go ahead and put in, I can put in that start date, or I can put it in years to say there's a 2-year waiting period or there's a 3-month waiting period. So this is a great place to update that, say when it's going to start, and then we'll then adjust the calculation accordingly. Again, in terms of including assets, here we want to say we want to keep those for retirement, but there are some cases where we may want to bring in certain assets or investments, then we can always go ahead and select them here to include them. From a what it means point of view, it's going to show us exactly the same. On the left, it's going to say this is the income that we need. Based on that, it's going to come up with the capital amount required today in order to achieve that. And then on the right, it's going to show the value of that income protection, what that's worth. Is having that 8.9 million today plus the 1.5 means that in this case, there's a shortfall of 2.2 million or 9,361 Rand per month. Now, the way to think about that is that either I need to, fill the shortfall with a capital lump sum disability cover of 2.2 million, or I need to increase that income protection by that 9,361 per month. Another option on disability is sometimes it makes sense to split the two. So to have two target maps, and so there's going to be some lump sum capital needs in the event of disability that I want to have capital cover for, and separately I want to have a target map where I look at the income need the client will have and what income protection they'll need in order to achieve that. So that's another option that is really works great if you really want to split those out, or you can do it like this, put them together and see, it's either a combination of the two, or we need the capital or the income protection. Right, and then if we go across to critical illness or long-term care, this is often a difficult one to plan for. We don't know exactly, what amount will be the right amount. Usually we have a house view around that, whether it's, 1 year of income or whether it's a specific lump sum. We defaulted to 500,000 as a lump sum, but of course you can edit that in the same way, unpack the needs, and then put in the cover the client has. All right. So that's a conversation where the client's in that accumulation phase and we want to talk about protection. We want to protect that income, understand what the client's needs are, what the family's needs will be, and make sure that we can protect that. Key points there is thinking about that term, that period, and what we can include versus what we want to protect with cover. But then if we move across and look at a client that's, in that sort of wealth preservation phase, and here we have, Luke and Caitlin. Luke is 55 at the moment. The kids are older now. They're out of university. They're moving on. We can see the home loan is a lot lower. Here, the conversation is really around balancing. The scale sort of tilts and we need less, risk cover, more pushing funds into savings for retirement, and a great way to sort of surface that conversation. It's obviously through target maps, but also using comparisons. So while the cover they had was the right amount for at the time, now given where they are in life and what the bond value is now, given that the kids are out of school and they don't need to account for that education anymore, we can see that they are overfunded in both death and disability, but Luke is quite underfunded when it comes to retirement. Now, a great way to surface that is, of course, select these check boxes here on the right and click on this compare function. Then it just brings it up all three on the page together, and we can have that conversation around potentially reducing cover on the death and disability side and funneling that more into retirement to try and bridge this shortfall. And the good news, coming soon, you'll be able to include this page in your reporting. So we're really excited about that, where you can create these comparisons and actually bring that into the PDF as well. But still, great conversation to surface it and have that balancing conversation with the clients. Okay. All right, then as we move into clients in that retirement phase. So here we have Joe and Katie. They've got a daughter, Jenny, and 2 grandchildren. And really here, I want to surface a couple of different features that can create clarity for this family. Here the conversation is more around, being organized. Is everything in place? So if you can use priorities to just drill into what exactly are the client's priorities or goals at this phase in life. And in this conversation, let's assume Joe said, for him, what's really important is that Katie feels organized, that she knows exactly what's going to happen in the event of death, that she knows what that transition is going to look like, that it's a smooth transition, that if there are any costs, that we understand them and we know that they are covered and catered for. And also what's important to him is from a legacy point of view. He's got this river house. He wants that to pass to the next generation, to go straight to his daughter, his grandchildren. That's the legacy that he wants to leave. So using priorities is just a great way of surfacing those. If we unpack it and, what really sits behind what they're trying to achieve and what will give them that comfort and feeling organized and knowing what that process will look like. And there's a couple of different features that we can use to bring that out. One thing I want to note here is for Joe, we've added, all of the income that he's currently earning. We can see there's a living annuity, a unit trust. There is going to be some costs. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. And then there's a couple of properties as well. I've also added in the will here under legal. And why that's important is adding it in here, I can also note where it is or that it's in place. I can put notes about, where to access it. That also creates a sense of it's there, it's in place, it's organized. But I can also select here that it can be used as a beneficiary designation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the impact on that. But if we go back into the priorities, what are some of the ways we can ensure that Katie feels organized and understands what that transition is going to look like? And one of the features that works really well for this is relationship maps. Now, relationship maps we know is to show how everyone is connected, but it's also a great way of showing any sort of flow or changes that we want to reflect. So we can show here that, in the event of Joe's death, that holiday home will pass to the children and grandchildren. But we can also show for Katie that the unit trust and property will first be dealt with in terms of the will by the executor and then flow to Katie, whilst the living annuity, as she's the beneficiary, will go directly to her. So you can see how we can surface that discussion and conversation and show what that flow will look like using features like relationship maps. Another great feature for this is the beneficiaries, being able to select who is the beneficiary on every asset or income or liability. And because I added the will under legal, I can even select the will estate as the beneficiary. So here another way of reflecting is say, in the event of Joe's death, this is what's going to flow to Katie. So, that half of that guaranteed annuity will continue. The assets that are going to flow to Katie, what's going to go to Jenny, Ella, and Owen, what's going to flow into the estate and be dealt with there to cover potential costs or liabilities. So we can, again, just visually reflect this, creating that feeling of I'm organized, everyone's on the same page, we all know what that flow is going to look like. And then going back to the priorities here, once you've created that feeling of organized and understanding what that transition will look like, one of the other conversations we want to cover is costs. What will the costs be? You can calculate that using whatever you use at the moment, or we've also got our standalone specialized calculators on the Work That Matters website. So you can always go onto this website, click on calculators. There's one for ANC, COP, and single. In this case, I've put the information here. They're married, anti-nuptial. So just to cover this, we've added in, the client's details. We've added in a little bit around residue to spouse and how they are married, with accrual or without accrual. I've put in the different assets that they have and who it's going to. So what's going to the spouse versus other, and the unit trust. And immediately upon entering that, it's going to calculate here what those costs are going to be. So we can see here's that amount that you saw on the map, but I can then copy this amount and bring it into asset map and into target maps. On these calculators, you can also add in policies, liabilities, as well as the spouse's details, and it'll calculate immediately what that looks like in the event of death, what the costs will be for the client, the spouse, and also in the event of joint death. At the bottom, you can also, some of the feedback we got is we want to see all those calculations, see how you're getting to those numbers. So here you can find all the calculations that sit behind those figures. and you can generate and send yourself a report. So you're welcome to use these calculators. They're available for everyone to work out what those costs will be. And then the key thing is bringing that into asset map, bringing that into the target map to really have a conversation with the clients around those costs. So you can see I've added it in here. I've also said it will be dealt with in terms of the world, but now I can go across into target maps and really show the impact of that. So by creating a custom target map, I can show that these are costs that we're going to need to cover in the event of death, including, something for funeral or last expenses. And then it's going to tell me, well, this is the amount of cover or investments we're going to need to cover those costs in the event of death. I can then show under what you have, that unit trust that's going to be going into the estate and how that can cover the cost and what that surplus would be. But similarly, if it was a deficit, I can have a conversation on how we're going to fund those costs. If we don't have the liquidity or life cover for, like in this example, then is it going to be covered via the sale of an asset? So it really just gives us a way of surfacing that conversation. All right, and then ending off, you can see how we can use relationship maps. We can use priorities to identify those targets, the beneficiary report, again, just to visually show clients what is going to happen in the event of death. What is that transition going to look like? How do we cater for the cost? And how do we make sure that everybody feels in control and knows what those steps are going to be? We can even then run a target map to show, for Katie, in the event of Joe's death, what incomes will continue, what incomes will stop, what costs are being covered, and can she still sustain the lifestyle that she needs, or what changes do we need to make? All right. So in closing off today, I just want to talk back to that word resilience. Think about in your planning process, how do we create that resilience in the plan by showing clients at those different stages, surfacing those conversations and giving them that sense of, I understand we have a plan in place. Should these events happen, or when these events happen, everyone is on the same page with what that plan is. And by that, we can really create that comfort that clients are seeking in those difficult times. Thank you very much.